Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to today's accounting design project. We are very excited to have Waqar Ali from HEC Paris today to talk about hedge accounting. So Waqar, you have 1 hour. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Young, and thank you to everybody joining in today. Greetings to everybody from wherever you are in the world. It's been a difficult situation for me with travel, but I am really looking forward to your feedback today. So, just to crack on with the presentation, the project started sort of by accident in the sense that Sanjeev just wrote to me once asking about what my views were on banks hedging activities, given that I have some work on the industrial or non-financial sector. And I was quite enthusiastic and started collecting data and hypothesizing how banks might act very differently from normal companies. So this is how the project started, and it took about a year to collect the data. And Yao and Shuyan joined in because they had really good banking expertise, and I brought in some hedging expertise, and now we have this really sort of beautiful piece that we'd like to introduce to all of you, and make some mark in the in this nexus of hedging and banking literature. So, oops. And when I was kind of thinking about the economics of things, came across this really good article. And in general, for people who are interested in hedging, risk management, or regulatory studies, this is a very good sort of resource. It's called risk.net, and they have good journalism on things. So they kind of said, hey, SVP debacle happened, and we're going to question, did accounting have a role to play? And this is how this project kind of fits in the accounting design project as well, just to see if accounting can intervene in the sort of the financial sector and kind of avoid certain bank runs and things. So it's a lofty goal, but this article kind of spoke the language of our paper in the sense that SVP had investments, financial investments that had to be monitored. And if accounting was easy, that monitoring could have been better. And maybe some of the problems with SVP could may not have prevailed. And in the same way, we kind of see, the SEC really interested in disclosures on interest rate risk, how the bank is managing them, and what type of sort of inputs go into their system. And the main input is kind of, are they using any instruments that will shield from interest rate sensitivity? So, given this sort of regulatory and sort of reporting motivation, this project is kind of focusing on the interest rate risk that the banks face. Just a quick introduction in terms of the business model of banks. They have long-term deposits, um, and sorry, they have these deposits that I've mixed up the two here. They have deposits that they get from people, and then they give it out in terms of loans, and they earn a term spread. And in that process, the balance sheet is exposed to interest rate fluctuation and exposures. And that sort of fluctuation or exposure has already manifested in various sort of deposit runs in the past, which makes interest rate risk management central to banks. What we're interested in is looking at this sort of holistic interest rate exposure of things that are shown on the bank's balance sheet at historical cost, but their fair values could change. And one of the inputs to that fair value fluctuation would be interest rate movements. So, does this exposure to interest rates affect the manner in which banks allocate their sort of investments or assets? What type of investments do they make, given that they have this exposure? How does the deposit franchise or the depositor base interact with this type of exposure? And in general, what are the banking outcomes when banks are managing risk in a certain way? Um, Hedging the interest rate risk, and that is quite common across the economy, whether it's financial or non-financial firms. They use financial derivatives, and the main sort of categories interest rate swaps. And we kind of have this sort of tension in the literature, or the starting point being that use of interest rate swaps is not that rampant. It's not very significant in a bank's portfolio per se. And we question, do accounting frictions stop banks from avidly using interest rate swaps? Yes, Sudipta.
So the swaps are for the same duration of assets and liabilities, but here you're talking about different durations or different lengths. So a swap wouldn't really work, would it?
This is a good observation because this is one friction that I will talk about very shortly. So banks have different timelines when it comes to deposits and the loans that they convert the deposits into. And they want to protect the value of those loans, for example, or financial securities, mortgage-backed securities that are interest rate sensitive. So there have been accounting frictions in which swaps, unless they match the maturity or duration or the length of the underlying asset, couldn't attract the right accounting treatment. So banks generally would like to employ swaps for a certain shorter time duration because they're not looking far out into 10 years or 20 years. But you're right, from a practical standpoint, the swaps are lower maturity and not as long as what the loans would be.
I think the issue is that they're trying to hedge on a portfolio level rather than an asset and liability level, as the
Mm-hmm.
standard assumes. But if you've got liabilities and assets that are both interest rate sensitive, the interest rate is going to move them both in the same direction. So there's a
Hmm.
natural hedge. And what you really want to hedge is the
Yeah,
net exposure, which in this
absolutely.
case will be long for the assets and short for the
Absolutely.
liabilities. And so,
Absolutely. But what the finance and the hedging literature have been telling us is that, hey, the deposits, they're quite sticky, they won't go anywhere in stable circumstances. So you don't really need to have any instrument for deposits. So we will also see that in our sort of work that deposits are not really hedged. But here comes the fragility when the deposit run happens, and then all of a sudden the balance sheet collapses. So you're right, there is a natural hedge in normal circumstances, but the deposits, they are not generally hedged by banks, but the assets, they're heavily hedged. But let me go through the some of the institutional details, and then if you have any more guidance, we can take that. Um, so given this tension that the banks, number one, they're not using that many derivatives for interest rate risk. And then we have this sort of conceptual and theoretical sort of evidences that go in both ways. That is the use of interest rate swaps helping the banks or not? And we see there is negative, positive, and insignificant outcomes coming out of interest rate derivatives. So the research questions that we have are sort of um, ambitious, but this rightfully so because these things have not been answered in the literature. So want to have a reporting sort of impetus to the question in which we ask that: is there accounting problems that the bank are stopping banks from using interest rate swaps? Um, and if so, what would be the outcomes if the derivative usage or interest rate swaps were increasingly used by banks? And therefore, we kind of do this sort of study to see what are the risk impacts and also the broader impact on asset allocation and the deposit franchise of banks. Yes, Sudipta.
so banks are also the counterparties to the swaps that the industrial firms are taking. So should they be trying to hedge those as well, or only the
I
core
will
swap?
show you a snapshot. So I spent a year collecting this data with an army of RAs and quite technical. So what you're talking about is the counterparty, what is the sort of customer service that they provide, and they are clearly earmarked on the balance sheet as client derivatives. And normally what happens is they take the derivative out for the client, and then they also enter into an opposite position such that the two they negate each other. So that is not really a point of any problem because you have a position in the positive direction, so to speak, and then one in the negative. So they both cancel out. So client derivatives are something that are generating fees for the bank. They are acting as counterparties in that regard, but they also have a back end leg that is sort of insulating the bank from a net exposure perspective. What we will be looking at is what the bank's own exposure is rather than what it's helping the clients manage on the client's front. So basically, to answer these questions, and we use the setting in which recently there has been a regulatory change in the accounting standards, which is directly related to what the banks are doing. So I look at this rule change from an industrial firm's perspective, but there are significant provisions that nobody has looked at so far, and they are specific for financial institutions. So there is treatment effects that have been unexplored, but connected to those are these important questions that are also missing in the literature. So we are trying to add to that. Just so that I summarize things so everybody has a better idea of what's going on in the paper. So what do we find? We find that when hedge accounting becomes easier for banks with the perspective of interest rate exposures, based on whatever this standard rules, these rules and this new standard contain, we see a significant increase in the use of interest rate swaps, which is kind of baseline. And then what is interesting is that the overall interest rate exposure does not change. And that leads us to understand better what is going on in terms of the banking dynamics. But we do see that the interest expense beta goes down. But the bigger story is as follows, in which fair value hedges, in which the asset liability management on the face of the balance sheet, when that is being stabilized as a result of the new rules, we see the banks that they are increasing their investments in longer duration loans and AFS securities. And the uninsured depositors are also responding to these hedges, which kind of gives us a nice sort of an asset and liability side outcome, which shows in the asset liability duration the wedge between the two increasing because now the bank is able to hedge the loans and securities, and as a result of that, the knock-on effect is that the duration or the maturities of loans and the AFS of the asset side are increasing. Consequently, the bank earns higher margins. It increases credit risk because once you are lending more, you're ending into this exposure, new type of credit exposure, so to speak. But we do have this sort of a positive effect also on banks that are constrained with regulatory capital requirements, in the sense they're also able to manage their liquidity better once they're able to hedge this type of risk. So this is the overall sort of dynamics that we see, that an accounting rule change is helping the bank act in a certain way, which increases risk management on the face of things, which results in a greater maturity mismatch between asset and liabilities when they extend more loans to their clients and also invest in newer securities. And the margin performance improves, but at the cost of credit risk. And there is some benefit for banks that are constrained by regulatory capital. Yes, Henry.
Maybe a bit of an uninformed question here, but is the magnitude of the result seeming reasonable to you, where you make hedge accounting a little easier and you observe a 32% effect?
This is basically a first order effect, so to speak. So there were certain, when I go through the reliefs, you will see that, the hedges that are being enhanced, they are relating to some serious restrictions that were in place, which were not in sync with the model of the banking model. As you will see, I will explain now, the key reliefs that the standard is giving us seem like, why did this not happen before? Why did the standard setter have to wait for so long? This type of an increase is also consistent with my other papers, in which I see the non-financial sector, in which we also see this. So this is the base first order, in which there is, a response to the core frictions. But you're right, in terms of the magnitudes of the overall effects, they are not this sort of double digit. We will see something different for the extended outcomes. But So again, if wants to work in the hedging space, I see this sort of coverage really useful. And I'm just going to quickly summarize some of the institutional background and then hypothesize for us before I show you the results. And here, at a very basic level, what's happening every period is that there is a certain risk. In the case of banks, we're looking at interest rate risk. And if we were to see and sort of look at it from this gray line, that risk needs to be hedged. And it is hedged using an interest rate swap, which is a derivative that can be seen in the green line. You see that the risk and the hedge, they move in different directions, which insulates this dotted line, which is the performance of the bank. So imagine if you had a risk and that was not being hedged, then that dotted line would be much more erratic. And this is where fair value hedge accounting comes in. Even though you might have a derivative that addresses interest rate fluctuation, if you do not apply hedge accounting to it, the earnings would show that fluctuation. So this goes to explain the importance of hedge accounting, that if you are cognizant of a risk and you're taking a mitigating action to reduce the risk, unless you apply hedge accounting, because of the way the derivatives are ordinarily reported in the income statement, the performance of the bank would be very volatile, and that would be not descriptive of risk management activity. So this is something that I would like to focus on, because these are the reliefs that are really helping the bank with asset liability management. Just a quick summary of what the bank does in terms of hedging. There's a lot of things going on, but the most important is the fair value hedge, which is targeting AFS and loans, and to some extent deposit and the debt. As Sudipta pointed out, that there is scope for those sort of to move in tandem. And these stores of value on the balance sheet, their fair value is being protected because their measurement basis is generally historical cost. But the fair value movements, especially downward ones, could reflect an erratic balance sheet movement, which is why the bank needs these interest rate swaps to stabilize the balance sheet. And then, if it does so, the swap is going to be shown in a different way if hedge accounting is not applied, and there are frictions to application of hedge accounting. There are some other hedges as well that the bank engages in, but in that case, there is no need for hedge accounting because the underlying risk is already on the balance sheet at fair value. So when the derivative comes in, it kind of acts as a natural hedge anyway. But this sort of blue box that I've highlighted is key to the paper and to the sort of mechanics of the way banks are managing their assets and liabilities. So what did the ASU do? What did this accounting rule change, do for the banks? These are the three main sort of components of the rule change, which I'm trying to explain to you visually, and I will go through them, each of them very very quickly. So there is the first one is really important that Sudipta also asked us in the beginning. So if you have a loan or if you have an investment that is 10 years, but you just want risk management for the first 2 or 3 years, you could not apply hedge accounting to the derivative. And it's very natural to have sort of hedges which are, closer to the time rather than extending all the way, all the 20 years or 15 or even 10 years. So partial hedges were not allowed the hedge accounting treatment when they were validly used for risk management. Then, as you know, the way the loans work, it kind of reduces in value when they're getting repaid. So prepayment risk was something that the standard setters were not looking at either. So they were not targeting any principal amounts that would be diminishing over the periods, which would then create an impediment or in terms of hedge accounting. And then with the so many different rates that are available for hedging, and that we had the movement from LIBOR to SOFR, those benchmark rate reforms were needed from much before. Just quickly in terms of the partial hedge. So if you have a loan pool that has, all these different times and you just want to hedge the specific portion of it based on the risk that that loan has, you couldn't apply hedge accounting to this before this rule change. So this is something serious for a bank that is targeting a certain vulnerable loan piece, and accounting rules don't allow it. So it's something that, is important for the bank. Then we have this sort of principal that is
But
diminishing over
that's
the
only
year.
the interest as in term structure, right? It's not taking into account the credit risk, which would be like
Yes,
CDS or something
of
else, right?
course, of course.
So,
This
okay.
would be simply basis risk coming out of interest rate financial movements, but the credit risk is definitely, but they have the CDS and they also have credit protection derivatives, which is not something that we look at, but you're right, that is a bigger sort of how the risk is coming from various dimensions. Credit risk is also a significant non-trivial aspect. So here we have again this sort of these combined strategies in which you have financial assets or you have loans which can have prepayment risk going on. They're prepayable assets, you know. So by the time that you see hedging something and you have a certain target principal in mind, and now you can have different sort of swaps that target different principal amounts. And this granular risk management is something that the bank is supposed to do anyway, and accounting rules had not caught up in time. I'm not going to go through this slide because this was an extension of the ongoing debate that I'm having with FASB these days as well, when they're changing the hedge accounting rules one more time. But this is simply saying that all these granular hedging activities that the bank is doing, the accounting rules need to catch up on them. And then, as Sudipta also pointed out, we see that this sort of overall rate is made up of various sort of components. And when the bank is sort of hedging the asset liability, it needs to look at specific things that is hedging, right? You need to have the right derivative for that specific rate. And accounting rules were not paying attention to this granularity of how the rate that is being hedged is, what is the composition of it. For example, if you are targeting the discount rate, the risk-free rate, then you should have a derivative for that. And the accounting rules make it much easier now to target that specific component. Then there are some other sort of reliefs which are not that significant for asset liability management for the banks. For example, the flows that are coming from loans, cash flow hedges, and this was something really important in the non-financial hedging space. Um, and then we have these reliefs as well, general reliefs in which you have to show hedge effectiveness. And this was also something which was much needed because the bank has to be more flexible in showing the users that our hedges are sort of effective in the sense they're moving in the right direction in reasonable magnitudes. So the standard has given a lot of relief to the preparers to not have the preparers get bogged down into a lot of compliance burdens. Um, yes, Ayun.
Hi, Waqar. I really liked your slide a few slides back, probably two, when you actually lay out all the different risks. So,
This one?
what? No, like next one. Next one you have a prime. Yes, this one. Sorry, one back. I
One
think
back.
one slide back. Yep. So I think that's kind of something I had in mind when you started talking that there are many different dimensions or aspects of risks. And you kind of focus on interest rate swap, but that there are also other interest rate swap kind of address one type of risk, right? According to your slide here, but there are also credit risk, duration risk, and liquidity risk that actually requires other instruments or to actually facilitate that. So I wonder, you have a theory that to kind of help us understand the interdependence of one type of risk. Once it's lower, how does that relates to the tolerance regarding another type of a risk? So if your interest rate risk is lower regarding, for example, duration, then does that mean that banks actually for the same given portfolio has a greater tolerance for credit risk?
Mhm.
Is there any theory on the?
It's a very interesting question, and there's no theoretical work on the interplay between the risk categories, at least from a theory standpoint that I know of. But from what I can tell you is that the way the banks are operating currently, they have the instruments that are taking care of certain risks that they readily have derivatives available for. So in terms of interaction or sort of conditional dependence of these different risks, the bank is not looking at it like that anyway. So, for example, if they're looking at credit spread, then they have credit default derivatives, which are standalone, and they are priced in whatever different way, which are kind of different from interest rate swaps. So at the back end of the Treasury Department, they have this understanding that we have good instruments that are sufficient for that specific risk without the interdependencies. But I didn't see any theoretical work that would explore how these risks will interact, or can a business have, sorry, can a bank have a hybrid sort of derivative that would attack both? Yeah, I could add to my sort of descriptions.
So I think this is a very important question and very good question. So and I think this is really related to the nature of the interest rate risk for banks, right? If you think about the two most important factors that drive banks' interest rate risk, those are banks' asset allocation decisions on the asset side, and then depositors' reactions on the liability side. And that's the way we design our analysis after documenting the first order effect of increasing hedge, and then we look at how banks change their asset allocation, and then how depositors change their behaviors. And as you can imagine, once depositors change their deposit behavior, that will naturally affect banks' liquidity. While if banks change their asset allocation decisions in terms of increasing their asset liability duration gap, and more specifically increasing long-term holdings of those loans, and then we find natural changes in terms of their credit risk as well. So because interest rate risk is just so fundamental to banks, if there's any shock to the flexibility in terms of hedging this risk that affects their interest rate risk management, then that naturally spills over to other different risk types. And that's something that we didn't really think deeply when we started this analysis. But once we see more data and looking at those interactions, we found that this is subtle, but quite sensible kind of chain reaction, starting from interest rate swaps, but then that naturally affects something else.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Waqar. So I think,
Hello.
yeah, this is actually quite a cool paper, then very carefully done. And then, I mean, the challenge here is like, I need to actually spend a lot of time to, understand like what's happening, given the complexity of this hedge accounting. I think your presentation is actually definitely helpful. But then I have two questions. Like the one question is like, so what was sort of like the motivation to change the hedge accounting to begin with? My guess is that it's been unnecessarily complex. So and then a lot of actually banks actually complain about, okay, we need to actually make it simplified. So we have like less constraints, so, and then we can actually have like a more freedom to, operate the banks in the way we actually want to. So in that sense, I think, do you see some sort of like, the document finding is somewhat consistent with what banks actually told, sort of like raised before the hedge accounting changes, or something very unexpected things they engage in. To some extent, like some of these, like the risk reallocation seems actually quite consistent with what they intended to. So I think, clarifying that part is actually very helpful. The second part is that, so what is sort of underlying mechanism to change their behavior? Is it actually mainly through this like the capital regulation, or like there's something different things going on? Because like in many cases, like you want to actually claim some real effect, there should be some very the concrete, the ratio that banks care. Oftentimes that's the capital ratio, right? So in this setting, is it like that, or something different thing going on? Those are the two comments. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've had some comments on these lines, and they're very useful in revising the paper. So I have some slides on the motivations behind what the bank is doing, and what is the sort of mechanism behind why the banking is thinking in a different way. You're absolutely right. Regulatory capital is one mechanism, and I will show you the results in which we see that the regulatory capital, for when it matters, that the banks that are constrained, they are making good use of this rule change. When it comes to sort of the other sort of substantive mechanisms on exactly what's going on with the standard, we have been following the debates by the bank before the rule came into effect, when the regulators were seeking comments from the banks, and the banks were constantly raising these issues. You're absolutely right. So in that sense, in a way, yes, these things are expected, but just stay tuned. Let me go through some of the motivations and see what is striking here is that the overall interest exposure is unchanged. So there is a certain coordinated effect that the bank, coordinated strategy that the bank has in mind, in which is using this derivative piece for the overall business model. Yes, Sudipta.
So back when FAS 133 was being debated,
The elephant in the room.
the banks were pushing really hard for this portfolio model, the natural hedge kind of model. And FASB basically said, we don't know how to do that. So we're going to let you choose either you hedge the asset or the liability, even though, what you really want is the net. So now the ISB has actually put out a draft on hedging this net exposure for the interest rate risk only. So the ISB is actually a step ahead of the FASB here. And so it might
ISB is a step ahead. I agree with you. I agree that ISB is more flexible. I mean, some of the intricacies we don't discuss in the paper is HTM, right? ISB has allowed HTM to be hedged for a long time. I used to implement IFRS 9 in several banks, and HTM was being hedged for interest rate. But FASB had a sour sort of feeling about it, never allowed it. But Yao and I were discussing a few days ago, they are considering putting the HTM on just to sync international rules because this is a big international accounting arbitrage going on. One American bank is not allowed to hedge HTM, and then the international bank considers, like this creates issues. But you're right that FASB is behind. Yeah.
they're not listening as well as the ISB is a different way to put it.
um, so I'm gonna move forward with. Sorry, my screen is stuck. Okay. So I think the main sort of discussion point here comes in from our sort of prior understanding of the deposit franchise as being one sort of source of natural hedge in the sense that if we have a stable sort of body of depositors, then the bank is simply going to convert those deposits into loans, and that will kind of create that natural hedge that we started the discussion with, and the bank is going to be insulated from interest rate risk because we're going to have both sides stable and moving in the same direction. But then we have um, the sort of caveat that the deposit franchise has been vulnerable over the years. And if it does get tarnished at some point, then the banks will not have that edge in which the asset liability management in terms of interest rate affecting both the assets and the liabilities cancelling out will not work as smoothly. So therefore, we kind of asked that if we were to remove these accounting frictions and based on the new standard, how will this affect the business model of the bank, given now it has available all these new hedges that were not previously within their reach? Just to offer you some insights into our hand collection process. Yao and I have been working together on this for a while, and we've learned a lot together on the disclosures and engaged a lot of assistance on them. We're focusing on sort of hedge positions of public banks over 5 billion. There is notional amounts of interest rate derivatives which are readily available, which are not on the financial statements, but give us the sort of precise quantity of what is being hedged. There is good information, good quality disclosures on types of hedge accounting. What are the sort of underlying items that are being the focus of risk management? Is it loans? Is it AFS? Is it deposits? Is it banks? Is it something else? And then we collect, we go into the quarterly data and collect dates of exactly which quarter did the bank adopt the ASU to kind of give us some precision on the identification front. We also collect the notional amounts parallel, which are on for from call reports, just to see, and I will show you quickly what that means for our sort of inquiry to inform the readers. But let me just quickly show you one example, just so that if anybody else is interested in this type of research, they'd know where to go. So here you see that the bank is kind of heavily concentrated on the counterparty service that they provide to clients, in which they have mirrored positions and they cancel each other out. So this 257 is not really of any use, because this is simply on net basis in terms of it's boosting the balance sheet, but it is not really subject to any accounting problems. The real issue is in the split on of the 23,000, where we have the cash flow hedge, we have the fair value hedge, and we have whatever is being disclosed, and we collect these sort of notional amounts by going into the 10 Qs, and that forms our treatment effect. So the first sort of result that we have here is around the basic quantities. So the basic hedge accounted derivatives, how do they change? And what is important here is that the core reports, which has been the go-to data source for the bulk of banking research in finance and accounting, that is showing a certain significant effect, but we show a split of that, which is only possible through the hand-collected data that we offer. So here we see that the hedge accounted derivatives, they increase, but the economic hedges, which is the second column, they don't increase because they do not benefit from those accounting reliefs. This kind of gives us some sort of relief, in the sense that we're trying to provide some rich data, which is not just what can be collected from swap, the call report hedge numbers. Yes, Henry.
Thanks. Yeah, again, coming from someone not that smart about banks, but I think it might be nice to see a little bit more descriptives of this finding, a trend plot perhaps. And also in the descriptive statistics, it seems like the outcome variable is 0 for quite a lot of firms. And it would be interesting to know whether this is kind of being driven by, some firms at that upper tail. And also, I'm interested to know why is this 0 for so many firms?
Yeah. So the scaling, we scale by total assets. You take a big scaler, and the prior literature is already telling us that, in terms of overall asset values, it's a very minority occurrence. So I think the descriptives are kind of in sync with what the finance literature have already told us about a low incidence of derivative usage by banks. So it's not something that is very common. Like when I started, I did mention that the derivative usage is not common. It's not high in economic magnitude, according to standard proxies in the literature. And then we have these multiple sort of competing impact of derivative usage. So yes, you're right that when you scale it by total assets of banks, it is a small amount. Yeah. You're right. But I think splitting the sample by understanding more about the composition, I think we do some of that work, which is in the back end on the online appendix. But we can certainly bring forward some of those details. But I think the short answer is that yes, the starting point is low incidence of interest rate swap usage.
And why were the year quarter fixed effects irrelevant in this test?
Because they are collinear with the ASU adoption. That is every quarter. It has a quarterly variation.
I wonder if it would be possible to,
So have the year effect. We have a certain stylized adoption pattern in which we have the bulk of adoption in 2019, minority adoption in 2017, and 18 has kind of intermediate adoption. So, and in my other hedging papers as well, I'm careful in not putting in a time fixed effect that will take away the ASU's variation.
I see. Maybe a trend. Maybe just even the plot would show that
Even
it's
the
not,
plot, yes.
just some trend.
I agree. Yes, you.
Oh, yeah. So I have
Ayo?
a similar point with Henry, actually. So I was wondering if more banks start hedging after the ASU 2017 adoption, not just the big banks doing more of it. And I think that could get at like what's the friction that the accounting rule is solving.
So I think Yao and I did some work on splitting in terms of size or trying to see is it just the small banks or the large banks or what is the variation in their adoptions. We find it's across the board. Large banks are benefiting in terms of higher magnitudes, but significance is across the board. Small banks are also being subject to friction. We thought that we would probably find it in the largest banks, but the effect is nicely spread across banks. So banks have had this on their radar in terms of the outcomes. Yes, Ayan.
Yeah, I have a similar question. I guess that all our questions are coming from Henry's earliest comment. I think, I don't know whether you have reported yourself, but I think I would like to see the number of unique banks in your sample and also kind of split it in based on size, because that market is very skewed, and then there are all kinds of different theories regarding their market power. So I think it will be interesting to see if it's across the board, but at least probably differential effects in terms of magnitude. The other thing is, I think when you address Henry's point about you were not able to include the year quarter fixed effect, is that because the adoption, even despite that they are scattered, is actually quite clustered? Like even firms are able to actually adopt it in different quarter, but in reality, the adoption quarter is
More than 40%, I think 45% is in 2019 when it becomes mandatory. So having a raw year fixed effect is just going to mean we're just focusing on the early adopters. So, I mean, I think we do some work. I think Yao and I, we did some work on the early versus on-time adopters, and we could not see a clear pattern of endogeneity arising out of the early versus on-time adopters. But you're right, there is this concentration of adoption. I think we see that in our revenue paper as well.
Yeah.
Sounds like you should just graph the adoption.
Graph the adoption pattern, yeah.
The other question on the big banks, do you see a difference between, say, the CFIs and the rest?
Sorry, which ones?
The systematically influential financial
So
institutions.
economically significant banks, the GSB, SES globally. Yeah, I think we had that something of that sort in mind, and when we did the size test, it kind of was an overlap of the same phenomenon, because the size is basically what the finance papers use for earmarking and bucketing the economically significant banks. I think those are the top most 5% or something, if I'm not right. I think Yao would know better.
And Dodd-Frank was a much smaller number. So, and they had much more scrutiny and all of that. So the question is the regulatory exposure much greater, in which case they need to do more hedging to avoid the regulatory penalties?
No, points well taken in terms of the heterogeneity in the systematic significant large as well as which have greatest regulatory exposure. I think this would add to the sort of understanding of the pressure points. I agree with you.
We do have an appendix in the paper that we basically split banks based on asset size above $50 billion versus less than $50 billion. We found significant effects for both groups, but the economic magnitude is much bigger for large banks, which is consistent with our expectation that this matters more for larger banks. We can, do more in terms of looking at extremely large banks, those systemically important banks, and see if there's difference. But in terms of this table, this is just a time trend. So in our main specification, we will look at the treatment effect of using the treatment effect of ASU on banks' asset and deposit. Then we will have a definitive design where we will have a year quarter fixed effect. So, and another point we want to highlight is that all the disclosures are mandatory. So although this is not a structured data that we can easily get from call report, but it is a mandatory disclosure that if you have hedge accounting, if you use derivatives to hedge interest rate risk, for example, you have to disclose that in your 10K, and that's that's the basis for our manual collection, and that's why we are confident about the quality of the data. I mean, Waqar has so many years experience in hedge accounting, and we hired very high quality RAs to collect this data, and mostly Waqar checked them line by line. So this is a lot of work, but we are pretty happy about the quality of the data. And so the many zeros that Henry mentioned, it is really consistent with the prior research that documents that, that's kind of the motivation of the paper, that, it seems derivatives are really designed to hedge this risk, but banks somehow don't use them that often. And the distribution is quite consistent with what we learned from the literature.
And I think you're right in terms of this anomaly that, hey, we have low incidence of their usage. But then look at the standard setter is going through a lot of motions to pinpoint the issues, spending a lot of regulatory resources, inviting common letters. I'll share some common letters with you now. And the largest banks are really, really interested in shaping the rules. And then now, as I spoke to Christine Botterson, there is a post-implementation review extensively going on each of these, in which we had the recent 2201 come out, which even refined even more of these sort of structured hedges. So it is interesting to sort of say, oh, you know what, on a scaled economic large basis, it's a 0.0% or something, but it is causing interest in how the banks are interacting with the standard setter. Yes, Ian.
Well, just a quick one. I think that both of you kind of highlighted your hand collection efforts. I think it would be nice to actually highlight how many banks you actually collecting that data, right? Just kind of showed us how representative that sample is, right? I think right now it's just not very easy for me to find that information.
Right. So we kept all the banks with over $5 billion assets, and that's about, I think that's over 150 banks.
About 160 or 170 banks. Yeah.
We should include that. Thank you. That's helpful.
We did start with 250 or something, and then obviously because of data problems and things, but they are all more than 5 billion. Because if we go down, I think we're a lot of community banks, which are just quite very specific, and they probably are not a representative of the sample. So this is the main regression in which we look at the main outcomes. The main outcomes are asset allocation and deposit franchise, sort of, which are on the balance sheet of the asset liability balance management from the bank. And the treatment is coming from this hand collected measure. This regression model is very similar to my other paper in JAR, which is focusing on very stylized risk outcomes of non-financial firms, which are totally different in mechanism. And here we're trying to do some econometrics that is helping us pinpoint the treatment effect without falling into endogenous concerns. Yes, Seva.
Yeah, I think I remember like you used this like same specification in your other hedge accounting paper, and then to some extent I think it makes sense. Like you want to actually see this like the time varying variation, as they actually use more or less of this like hedge. You want to actually see the variation, but at the same time, this is somewhat unusual if we think about like very sharp, like definitive design, in a sense that the reason why actually they choose this hedge, there might be some other underlying reason. So this underlying reason is actually affecting both hedge accounting and then the outcome variable at the same time. So we're not really sort of like, running like the sharp diff in diff. Rather, just we actually looking at this like, sort of like the, correlated the outcome at the same time. So I guess like, just, for some, for your, the robustness purpose, I think, do you have you thought about like some sort of like the very, I don't know, intuitive, like a pre-exposure measure to this like the hedge accounting? I think that might be very helpful to document.
We're doing the standard procedure, which I did in my other paper. That's the short answer. I'm going to be very honest with you. The entropy balanced method that gave us sort of relief from somewhat from the concerns that you're raising. That hey, you know what, this treatment has its own determinants, and then if you were to entropy balance the banks with a split, then you would kind of address. Obviously, cannot remove all 100% endogeneity from any paper in the world. But what we can do is probably like, show whether the different cuts that fall into these buckets, some of which you've just already proposed, can help with those robustness. Do stacked. We do all different types of fixed structures. Kind of banking on my other hedging papers to support this. I think we also do the binary one, and it still shows up. So I think all those in collection would. The basic idea is, Seva, you're right. We're trying to capture the cross heterogeneity of the treatment effect, because what the bank is doing, it's deciding on the hedge every period to achieve a certain asset liability outcome. But trying as best as we can. If you have more suggestions, please advise. We're happy to do that as robustness. Yes, Young.
Yeah, just real quick. I thought that this is a clarifying question. So like your different diff, one is a time dimension, right? It's a scatter. You said about 40–50% are concentrated in 1 year. And the other one, my understanding is that Sewa's point is that you should not use the post-period ratio to kind of like to partition your sample. You should actually stop. So like everything up till the point they adopted this new standard will be the ratio you capture in your derivative hedge, but you do not include any post-period information in your different diff interactive term. And then you have data in the pre and post period. So for JP Morgan Chase, the notional amount of interest rate derivatives deflated by the total asset, you should use up till the time when they adopted ASU 2017, but you should not use the information during the post period in your interactive term. So that right now your derivative hedge has a subscript IT, but then you should only have I, and then that should use the most recent quarter, like probably right before the adoption. Your treatment and control should be assigned before
Right,
the
right.
adoption.
That is what
Otherwise,
we're
you
trying
have
to
the
do with the
post-period.
entropy. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, because it's high frequency in terms of quarterly frequency, that we're trying to put in the hedge, and then it's giving us certain outcome of that. Um, we have the data from all the way up till 2021, in fact, 2022, 23 as well. So it's not like it's a lopsided minus plus adoption. Still have sufficient pre-period and the post-period. What you're saying is that we should probably try it with T-1. Is that a fair comment from you? Yeah,
You think
T-1. Yeah.
different than your treatment control assignment, you cannot use any
Mhm.
post-period
Well,
information.
so this is basically a modified diff and diff, and some of the econ papers are using modified diff and diffs. By the way, that's how I came up with my jar papers idea, by reading those econ papers that are using modified diff and saying, but you're right, we do robustness in terms of, a quarter ahead or before. I think that can be easily done.
Thank you.
So yeah, so here we see that, okay, so now they're using more derivatives and we want to explore sort of the outcomes. The first is to have a look at how is the bank managing the interest rate exposure. And we see that the first order effect is here, the maturity gap between assets and liabilities is widening, and it's coming from the asset duration, the asset side of the balance sheet, with the liability side unaffected. Within the assets, then we explore further just to see where is the bank channeling this increased risk appetite that it reduced using the hedges. And we see that it is investing more in long-term assets and specifically long-term loans. And obviously the cash is substituting away, going into those loans. And then corresponding to that is what's going on the liability side. And here we see that the depositors, the uninsured depositors, they are supporting, or they consider these new hedges as favorable. So the sensitivity of the hedge to the uninsured deposit flows is positive, which kind of gives us a complete picture of how the asset liability management is panning out. in terms of both sides of the balance sheet. I just wanted to bring this from an accounting design perspective, that how users they go into the accounting rules to pinpoint what are the pressure points before they even implement the accounting rules. So this is all happening, and I think might be useful in motivating the T-1 or the timing issues. So here we see that the banks are telling us in T-1 or T-N before they have even adopted the standard, during the common letter phase, what are the problems that they're facing? And this kind of gives us some relief that, hey, if they all are constantly mentioning fair value hedge reliefs and general problems with complying with effectiveness tests, then should the action lie in these or not? And this is, we'll find to our pleasure that yes, it is coming from fair value hedges, because in the comment letters years before the adoption, the banks were telling the regulators that, hey, we have problems with fair value hedge, not really with cash flow hedge. So the fair value hedge is where the action is coming from because it is inherent to the asset liability management of banks, and it is not really coming from reliefs intended for others. So this kind of also helps us with somewhat with the concern that, hey, are these something that that make sense in terms of the bank's business model? Um, and then this is what I'd like to come to. I think Sevas and a few others raised this, that, hey, if the banks had some relief and they used them to their benefit, then how do we know what really is happening in the background? So what is the bank really doing? And I think with these sort of three areas, we kind of pinpoint as to what is happening on the ground with the bank, the way they are implementing these newly available hedges. So first, we kind of explore, does it reduce interest rate exposure overall or not? Then what is the effect of this activity, which is the asset liability management, on credit risk? And then obviously liquidity risk as well as credit risk. So the first one in terms of exposure, and here we see that in my other paper, it kind of shows that interest rate exposure goes down and remains low for the years following adoption for non-financial industrial firms. But then here we see that, okay, if the bank is already well hedged, exposures are generally lower compared when the older literature tells us this, then would it really have an effect? So we don't find that the overall interest rate exposure goes down or not. We did see interest expense beta go down, but that's pretty much where it stops. The bank is kind of reaching a new equilibrium in which it is reducing interim exposure using hedge activity and then kind of building in more exposure by expanding their sort of loan portfolio. So overall, interest rate risk exposure does not change much. And then the interest margin kind of goes up because obviously they did invest incrementally in long-term loans, and insured deposits stayed, so they could earn that term spread. That was the beginning point of the paper, that this is how the bank's business works. So interest margin goes, and below the line, so to speak, here we see that this is going to have a knock-on effect on now whether all these loans are of higher quality or not. Yes, Peter.
Hi, Waqar. Thanks for the presentation. Unlike other people who've said something similar, I really know very little about hedge accounting. So, forgive me. Is it true that the IFRS treatment of these prepayment assets is different under IFRS and US GAAP?
Biggest difference, Peter, which still remains unresolved in FASB, is HTM. Held to maturity securities are disallowed hedge accounting if any interest rate swap is used to manage the interest rate risk of held to maturity, because FASB says that you're going to hold it to maturity, keep on showing me at historical cost. Even if you do have an interest rate swap, you're not allowed hedge accounting. So banks don't use interest rate swaps for HTM. But IFRS, Barclays, UK banks, European banks, they use interest rate swaps to hedge held to maturity. So short answer to your question is,
with
IFRS
regards to the
rules,
hedge ineffectiveness issue, is there a difference or not?
hedging effectiveness, not so much. hedge effectiveness pretty much the same.
Okay.
They have the same. They have minor reliefs, minor differences going on between.
So you don't have a
how they-
kind of useful control group that you can use to control for some of these sort of other
we
time
yeah
variant effects which could be driving results.
yeah we have in the sample the staggered adoption to rely on number one. Number two, there are banks that they don't use hedge accounting throughout the sample. So there is those that have a revealed preference of never using hedge accounting, never using sort of hedges for as interest rate swaps. So that is implicitly built into the sample, which is also the basis of entropy balancing. So these two things we're adopting, but ideally you're
Although I
right.
guess
Okay, if we were to
there's
have
some
a
sort of selection issues there, right? Because those
yeah
firms likely
yeah.
have different business models, products, uh,
So we are heavily
balances, and
relying
so
on
on.
entropy balancing for the endogeneity
Yeah.
concern that you were raising, and then obviously the staggered. Yes, you're right. One comment I do have to make about IFRS 9, for example, if we were to use that, number one, there is a coordination because it was part of the convergence project between FASB and IASB. So there is a level of convergence already. So even if we were to use, there would still be a contaminated control group, whether it's Canadian IFRS or European IFRS. So this is exactly what happened in my other paper as well. And the referee kindly resorted to allowing for this revealed preference of never users that are not being pulled into either direction of picking up or dropping down derivatives. So I think that kind of gave us this stable group that was unaffected, so to speak, by the rule change.
Okay,
But
thank
yeah,
you.
Sorry, we required to
yes, yeah.
interrupt. You're running over time.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe we wrap up and then I stop
Yeah.
recording. And then I think Sewa still has a question for you. Yeah, if Sewa has time
I
to
am
say.
going to quickly wrap up. Thank you for all the questions, everybody. The last set of is that there is a motivation from coming from a liquidity risk management perspective as well, where we see banks that are smaller in terms of that they're more constrained with regulatory capital, they benefit from this rule change more. In conclusion, contribution hinges on kind of this nexus in terms of the risk management literature and the literature on the deposit franchise of banks. We also look at the accounting rules specific to derivatives versus security level rules in the past, and obviously the hedging literature in which there's a lot of benefits shown of the cash flow hedge, but here we see the banks are really benefiting from fair value hedges. In summary, this was what I discussed with you, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in.